All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Meredith. I'm a librarian at the Harrington Library, and my co-presenter today, who will be handling our chat moderation, is Jamie. She's also a librarian over at Harrington. So as I mentioned before, just to cover it for anyone who just arrived, we don't have any mics, so please do, for participants, so please do put your questions in the chat, or there's also the Q&A. Either of those will work. And Jamie will either answer them directly or she'll share them with me to answer in the program. There will also be a follow-up email with a recording, so look for that in the following days after the program. So what you'll need to get the most out of this program is a Google account. So if you don't already have one, you can sign up for one for free. It does take a little bit of time, but not too much. So if you wanted to do that and then follow along, feel free. If you've already got a Gmail, then you've already got a Google account and you're set to go. If you want to follow along with what we're doing today, you'll either need to do a split screen setup with Zoom and Google Sheets, where you can have them both on your screen, or do a dual screen setup. Or if you have a separate device, that'll also work. That way you can watch and work on your device at the same time. So we do have a practice workbook for following along, which is available from the Google Drive for the library. Jamie will be posting a direct link to that in the chat. It should also have been included in your reminder email, I believe, for the class. So to be able to edit in this document, you will need to save a copy to your Google Drive. See if I can demo that for you. See if it'll behave for me. Open Sesame. Here we go. Bring it over here. So it'll open up in here in the folder. You'll go down to the Google Sheets Pivot Tables Practice, and you'll click on that to open it up, double click. And then see how it's in the view only. You'll want to go to File and make a copy, and that will let it save to your own personal drive so that you can follow along with the program and edit in the document. So you'll do make a copy, pick where you want it to go, and it should work for you. If you have any problems with that, do let us know and we'll see if we can troubleshoot it for you. So let me close out of this and close out of this one. Okay, so other things that will help you with this program is knowing how to navigate a worksheet in the, or I guess a sheet within the worksheet. So terminology-wise, Google Sheets is a little bit different in what they call their different parts of their program versus Excel. So what you may know as a worksheet in Excel is just a sheet in Google Sheets. And then the whole workbook for Excel is called a worksheet in Google Sheets. I'm assuming that has something to do with copyright. All right, and then also how to enter and format data will be useful to get the most from this program. So what we're planning to learn today is how to prepare a data set for use in a pivot table, and then the various ways you can arrange fields within the pivot table layout to highlight useful data, including grouping information together and using different ways of filtering and slicing your data. So just a quick overcap of what is a pivot table. So a pivot table is a powerful and flexible table in Google Sheets that lets you summarize your data. So you can do this from a list that you have in a Google Sheet or from another table that you have on a different worksheet, or you can get the information and import it from other sources. Today, we're keeping it simple and using data from a sheet that we've already got in our document. So we'll look at an example of what we are working with today. So this is an example of a data set that you can use for a pivot table. And what the pivot table will do will allow you to easily organize and rearrange, or pivot the data to meet your needs. So for today's class, we are working with our sample data here, and we are pretending we are an organization that sells confectionery treats to grocery stores and convenience stores. So our customers are all going to be places where you can buy, snacks and other products like that. We have our salespeople here. We have the products that have been sold, what region they have been sold in, the date of that particular invoice, the cost of the individual item, and the number of cases purchased, and then the total of that particular order that has gone through. So we've got quite an extensive set of data here. When you are working with a set of data that you have been working with frequently, you usually don't need to check to make sure that your data has no gaps in it. But that is something you'll want to check if you haven't worked with the data in a while, or other people have been using it and maybe editing it as well, just to make sure that what you're working with doesn't have any extra columns, extra rows, or extra cells. So for us, we've got quite an extensive amount of data. We can scroll all the way down and make sure that it's all here and good. Quite a lot to look at. It goes all the way down to, if we keep on going, 910 is our last row that we have. So that's a lot of data, and that's because we're looking at sales for a 2-year period. Now, the problem with having just a table like this is it's very limiting in what you can get from this information. You can't tell who's really been selling a lot, what region has been getting the most orders, what product has got the most interest. There's really not much you can get from this. You can organize it using filters, but it's not particularly helpful. You can, if you want to, use functions to get a little more use out of your data from over here. But to do that, you have to write a pretty complicated series of functions to get anything usable. And if you wanted to change what you were looking at, you'd have to rewrite those functions, and it's a huge process. So what pivot tables do is they basically do all of this complicated functional work here in the background, so that all you have to do is pick what you want to look at, and it does the calculations for you. So very handy to have. So let's get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and click in our table of data, and we're going to come up to Insert here from the menus, and then we'll go down to Pivot Table. And the nice thing is, as long as you have any cell in your data set highlighted, it can pretty much figure out for sure where your information is. Now, if, say, you accidentally delete this, or you didn't have the cell highlighted correctly, so you're working with nothing there, you can hit Select Data Range over here. And it does a suggested one, but if you're not sure that this is correct, if you don't know that it goes all the way down to 910, you can come over here to the range and do Control-A, and it will select all of the table information. And this is part of the reason why having no spaces is really important, because the program only knows to recognize a whole table as information that is right next to each other. So if you had an extra row, you'd end up losing whatever's underneath that row, and an extra column would cut off whatever's on the other side of that column. But that way you get all of your information. We say, okay, we want that data range. And now we have two options here of how we want to work with our pivot table. We can either do a new sheet, which would create a whole new tab at the bottom here, or we can use an existing sheet. Now, there's benefits and downsides to both. Doing the pivot table in your existing sheet means that you'd have it readily available and next to your data. So if you're planning on changing your data a lot, or you want to be able to see everything all at once, you can. The downside to it is it's kind of cramped and messy. If you're wanting to use your pivot tables for more presentational type things, or you want to be able to focus on just the data in the table, it's much better to do it in a new sheet. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to select New Sheet, Create, and as you can see down at the bottom, right after Creating tab, we get a Pivot Tables tab. And in our pivot table, we have a little placeholder here because we haven't selected anything to put into our fields. Do we have any questions so far about getting to this point?
Looks like we are all good so far.
All right. So if anyone's familiar with pivot tables in Excel, then you might be familiar with having a little window open here for editing the pivot table. Sheets does the same thing, but it looks a little bit different. So instead of having all of the fields, which are pretty much the exact same thing as our tables headings up here, so these are what become fields in pivot tables. Instead of having that listed all here, in order to see the fields that are available, you actually have to click on the individual areas where those fields will go. And you can see we have all these different fields to work with. So fields areas are the 4 little areas here, and these will help inform how the data is sorted. So rows is going to put whatever field you pick into the rows of the table. Columns will put it into the columns. Values are what the numerical parts that we'll be looking at because our spreadsheet does have a few different options for that. And then filters lets you tailor the data to specifically focus on certain aspects, certain parts of the fields. And so we'll get into how each of these work one at a time. But first, we're going to try to replicate this table that we have here. And we're going to see how we can do that with the pivot table. So we are going to first add our rows. And we'll select salesperson because we want the names on the side here. And something you'll notice is that the columns and rows do not automatically adjust to the size of the information. So if you're wanting to keep it nice and neat, you can always adjust your column width up at the top here, or you can also choose to wrap your text, which will cause it to expand and widen out the rows. And I'll show you how that works in just a moment. So we've got our rows set up. We need our columns. And let's see, we were working with, I believe, products. So let's make sure we're matching that. So products, yep, products there. And so you see here, we've got the longer bits of information. So what we're going to do to make sure everything fits is we're going to wrap our text and see how it expanded that second row. And that way we can read our product names nice and easily. Now we don't have any values yet because we haven't decided what we want to look at. We're going to pick our value. And in our chart, our table on the other side, we were looking at number of cases. So we'll do that here as well. And so it automatically puts in the number of cases of each product each salesperson has sold. It has their grand total of all of the products sold, and then the grand total of each product sold separately here for the grand total altogether of everything that's been sold unit-wise. So let's see if that matches up. We've got our grand total of 7,997 and 7,997. Awesome. So something that the pivot table does is it does automatically sort your products by alphabetical order in ascending order. So starting with your A's to your Z's, same with your names here. You can change those around if you want to. We'll get into that a little bit. You can also choose whether or not you want to have your grand totals for everything shown. So if you're only wanting to focus on the number of products sold, you could turn off your column there, and then you don't see the grand totals for the people, you just see the grand totals for the products. You can also do that with the salespeople if you're focusing on their numbers specifically. So say you're doing a performance review or something like that. So you can also, like I said, change how it's sorted. So you can do descending, which flips it, or you can also change for, instead of focusing on the field, you can look at the sum of the number of cases. Grand total will sort it from the grand total up here down to here, so you can see who is your underachiever in selling products and who is your overachiever, and everyone in between. You can also play around with some of the other stuff. You can sort it in by product. So this one will now be in ascending order. So who sold the least chocolate cream cakes, who sold the most. So you can use that to highlight different aspects of your data. And pivot table at least is, a nice response to undo. So if you make any changes and you want to get it back to how it was before, you don't have to try to remember. You can just undo, and it'll go back to how you had it before. So undo is your friend when you're playing around with all of these different fields. So let's see. You can also do that in the columns. So if we wanted to do the columns, we could do grand total and see which products have been selling the best at the bottom here. So it looks like our #1 seller is crispy cookies. So we're going to undo that back to how we had it. All right, any questions so far?
Not at this time.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the part where it's actually pivoting and switching up information. Because right now we've just got a table that looks exactly like the table we've been working with. But we have been able to move the information around a bit to meet different needs. So we're going to switch our values, and we're going to change it. So we're going to take away our number of cases, and we're going to add in instead item cost. And because our format up here is set to automatic, it will automatically change it to monetary format, so currency. Now, if you're wanting to change anything in this, like instead of having the small change there, since we're working with such big numbers, that's usually not super important. You can, there's a few different ways you can fix that. You can either decrease your decimal place up here on the bar by reducing it by 2. If you want to do the whole section, you do have to make sure to highlight everything, including your grand totals down here. So you can do decrease that way, and it automatically rounds it. Or you can select from more formats, and it actually has a specific one for currency rounded that you can pick, and that'll automatically change it. So those are options. You can also find the same formats up in format up here, down to numbers, and all of your options here. So if you do change the format, something to keep in mind is it will keep that format. You've taken it out of automatic format, so it won't change back. It'll stay in monetary format. So if you decided to go back to your number of cases, you've got $ in front of your cases now, and we don't want that. So if you wanted to fix that, easy fix, just go back to automatic, and it reverts it back to the flexible changing format. So any questions about that, about different values?
Looks like we might have one. Yes, could you please show the automatic part again for us?
Absolutely, absolutely. So easiest way to show it is we'll switch over to our item cost. So while it's in automatic and I haven't changed anything, if I switched back, it would just go back to the number because it's automatically changing. But if we do anything to change it, like choose currency rounded, we're taking it out of that automatic setting and changing it to a different format. And so when we change it back to number of cases, see, we've got that. So all you have to do is just select automatic again, and that'll fix it. You want to do that instead of picking like maybe a general number or plain text or something like that, which would in theory, work. It would look the same, but automatic allows you to change the values and not have to change the formatting unless you're wanting to get a specific type of format out of it. So default is always automatic. Did that answer the question?
Looks like it.
All right. So we're going to do some more data manipulation here. We're going to add in the customers to our column. So these are the stores that buy the product from us. So we're going to add customers. And you'll see this greatly lengthens out the table, which at times could be not particularly useful if you're wanting to have a nice, small, compact table to look at. But the nice thing is you can collapse each setting or each heading, not setting, heading down. And so if you're wanting to have, like, say, a meeting where you're looking at your different products and you want to examine the different companies that have bought from you for that product, you can simply open and look at that particular product at the time and see who bought what from whom. So you can see, for example, Meg Benson sold 9 cases of chocolate cream cakes to Happy Mart. So you can easily collapse and expand your different groups to look at them. And that way you can easily access information without having to do too much work to get to it. So you can also, if you are interested in changing how it's set up, you can switch the customer and product by clicking and dragging and putting customer above product. And what that'll do is you can look at the individual companies and see what they have bought of products. So again, we can shrink these down so you can see the totals for the individual customers. And if you wanted to find out how those numbers broke up, you could open it up and look at the numbers. And it's just a different way of organizing it. So instead of focusing on the products, you're focusing on the customers. You can also switch it up even more by taking the customers and dragging it over here under salesperson. So say you're wanting to look at each individual salesperson's work with the specific customer. This way you can see who's been working with what company, how many they've been selling. You can collapse it down so that, say, you're doing a group presentation where you want to talk to each person or even a personal review, and you can expand it and see how they did. So you have the option of collapsing and expanding the data. And again, you could also flip-flop them as well if that meets your needs. And then you can see who's been working with Happy Mart, who's been working with Quick Stop, so on and so forth. So any questions about moving the data around and having multiple sets of data in your different areas?
Looks like we are good.
Okay. So we're going to move on to how to group your data. So we're going to move to the tab down here called Data Grouping. If you're practicing at home and you have any trouble or you get to a place you don't want to with your pivot table, but you want to get to practicing with manipulating the data, you can always use the manipulating tab down here, and it is a preset version of our pivot table that we just were playing around with. So for future practice, manipulating tab there, but now we're moving on to how to group. So we're going to focus first on grouping by date. So this comes in handy if you're really wanting to get some use out of your date information, because what we have right now is individual dates, which can go on for quite a ways and it spreads out the data in a way that's not particularly useful. So we can, instead of having each individual date, we can group them in a way that really lets us look at more detailed information and get some actual meaning out of it. So you want to make sure that you have one of the dates selected. It doesn't have to be any specific date. And you do also want to make sure that your date information is not only accurate, but doesn't include any weird anomalies like, say, a February 30th, which doesn't exist. Because that will throw off the program and it won't be able to figure out what you're asking it to do. So you want to make sure all your dates are correct, but you have one cell highlighted. You can right click and go to Create Pivot Date Group. And you'll see all sorts of options we have to work with here. So quite a few varieties of information. We're going to focus on first the year. So we're going to select year. And you'll see that it's broken up all of the dates and put them into two categories, 2019 and 2020. Does anybody have any questions on how to do that? Do I need to go through it again?
Looks like everyone is still with you so far.
Okay, good. Well, and we'll be doing it for a couple of different types of date information, so you'll get some practice out of that. Now, to make our heading a little more useful here, we can actually double click and delete that date dash just because we know it's what it is. We want to focus on year, and you can change that. And what we'll do is give your date over here a little subheading of year and let you know that's what it's called in the table. So if we want to break this information up a little bit more and really dive into, let's say, the quarters, so the fiscal quarters of each year, we can do that. To get started, we first have to add another set of rows. We're going to add another date in. And so this goes back to the individual dates. We're going to right-click on one of the dates, do Pivot Table Date Group, and then we'll select Quarter. And now we have quarters 1 through 4 for each of our years. And again, so we can actually, read that it says quarter, we're going to get rid of that date there. And now we've got years and quarters. All right, and we're going to do one final one just so we can really hash out this information. We're going to break it up into months. So we need to do one more set of date to our row and right click one more time down to Create Pivot Table Date Group and month. And you'll notice as you select different groupings, those become unavailable. You can't do multiple of them. So you wouldn't be able to click on year and quarter, but we want month. So there we go. And you'll see the 3 months that fall under each quarter are available there. And again, pretty up our graph here, or not a graph, our table. So now we've got year, quarter, and month, and you can see year, quarter, and month over here. We can choose to collapse and expand. And when you collapse one quarter, it collapses the same quarter in the other year. So you can see that we've collapsed quarter 1 in 2019, and it's also collapsed. it's collapsed the Q1 or quarter one in 2020. So let's play around with this as well. So one downside to these groupings is that they don't carry over to other things like the filter. So unlike Excel, you wouldn't be able to take your months and drag them down to the filter and be able to filter by months. There is a workaround for it, but it's very complicated. So if we have time at the end of the class, we can go over that, but we'll have to see about that time-wise. So any questions about grouping dates?
Yes. So we had someone who asked if you could show us how to separate the years again. They've already grouped 2019 and 2020, but stopped there. So if you could just run through that part for us again.
Sure.
How we got those years.
Sure. So I'll just back it up. Or actually, easiest thing to do is just delete the fields over here. So get rid of quarters and months. So if you, I'll just start from the beginning. We'll just go all the way through because it's easier that way. So if you've got your dates, you right-click on any date in that column, select Create Pivot Table Group, or Create Pivot Date Group. There we go. Select Year, breaks that up, and then you'll add another date field to your rows, which again gives you the individual days, but we're going to group them by quarter. And so we've broken that up one more time, and then one more to get us our months. So got another date field added to our rows. Right click, create pivot table date group, and month. And there we go. And again, you can pretty up the top here by getting rid of those date dash year, date dash quarter, date dash month. And so you can rename that in a way that works better. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so something else we can do, much like I was showing earlier with rearranging the data, you can switch things around to better meet your needs. So right now we're looking at the year broken down into months, but you can also move months over to above year. And I got rid of quarter because right now we're not focusing on that by just clicking the X button. And this way you can actually compare individual months and how you did in each year. And this can be useful to see if you've been making progress. So like, for example, in January, the Northeast region, it looks like every region increased their sales. They have an increase in number of cases. And you can see, which regions increased by how much. And that way you can do a comparison across 2 years very easily. You could do that with quarters as well. So if we undo, and move our quarters, and we don't want to get too complicated, so we're going to get rid of our months and move our quarters. We can compare quarters. So if you're looking fiscally at, how did we do last quarter versus this quarter, you can switch your data up a little bit, change your fields around, and examine it side by side a little more easily. All right. Something else to note is if you are familiar with, again, Excel and their pivot table, one feature that is missing from Sheets, unfortunately, is there's not a way to group by a set period of days. So for example, in Excel, you could pick 14 days period and pick when that starts, and you could use that to specifically look at sales done in individual pay periods. Or, if you had other types of things, like say you had a period of days that your business was doing a sale and you wanted to see how that compared to other parts of your data. And unfortunately, as of right now, Sheets does not have that as an option. Now that may be something that comes out in the future, but it's not something we can work with here. But that's something to keep in mind if you're looking for that functionality. It's not available. So we've grouped by dates, and now we can move on to grouping by other things, unless anybody's got some questions related to dates.
Not at this time.
Okay. So we'll move down to our next sheet here, other grouping, and we have a pre-set up pivot table here with the regions that we're looking at and the different products that have been sold in those regions. So if we wanted to group by, say we wanted to look at the grand total for the East and the grand total for the West, and we didn't want to have this 4 divisions. We wanted to know, specifically how we're doing in the East versus the West. We can actually group these together. So you'll want to first click Northeast, and we'll group the East together. So we're going to press Control and hold it down, and then click on Southeast so that you can see both of them have been highlighted. And then we'll right click, and it doesn't matter which one you right click on. You can either do Southeast or Northeast. It'll pull up the same drop down. There's Create Pivot Group, and you'll notice that it doesn't say date because the program knows that you're not working with dates. You're working with different information. So when you click that, it groups them together over here, and then it creates a second, you call it a second grouping, a second group of columns. And because we haven't yet grouped Northwest and Southwest together, they have their own grouped regions column. So we're going to clean this up a little bit by grouping these 2 together now. And when you do that, you want to make sure to click on the bottom here on this row. So we'll click on Northwest, and then again, Control click Southwest, and then right click, Create Pivot Table Group. And now we've got that one grouped together. And we can change the name to something more useful because, having just the columns, comma, titled here doesn't really give us an idea. So we're looking at East, and then West. And now that gives us a little something better to look at. And we can, again, collapse the data so that we can see the totals for them here. Or we can expand it so that we can see the breakout of the different smaller regions. Any questions on that? That one's a little more complicated than dates because you actually have to do a little bit more maneuvering. It's a little more complicated. Any questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, well, that's great because we are going to do the same thing down here with our products. So you can see we have 2 types of pies. So let's say we wanted to be able to see what our total was for all pies sold. And this would work even better if we had a bunch of different types of, like multiple rolls, multiple cookies, multiple cakes. But we're working with a smaller data set just because, it's a little easier to handle. So we're going to click and then Control click our panda pies. So we've got moon pies and panda pies selected. Right click, Create Pivot Group, and see it's created our grouped products. So we can rename our different groups here. So this pies group, we can rename pies. And then we can change our rolls to rolls, and our crispy cookies to cookies. And then finally, cakes. So we've only got one type of cake and one type of cookie and one type of roll, but you could see how if we had multiples, you'd be able to see the grand total of your rolls, the grand total of your pies, your cookies, and your cakes. And you could also collapse it down so that if you're wanting to focus on the totals and then talk about the individual products later, you could do that as well. So that is the basics of doing groups that are not dates. Any questions on that?
No questions. Looks like we're good to move on to the next topic.
All right, so our second to last topic here is we're going to look at different kinds of values, because so far we've just looked at the default sum value. So in your value section, the default is always going to be the sum of number of cases. So right now we're looking at the number of cases that each salesperson has sold. We're not bothering with columns for this example. But say we want to get a little creative and see some different types of information, put it into different frames. We can change to show from the drop down here at show as. There's a few different options for being able to see how each employee has contributed to the company percentage-wise. We can click on the grand total percentage here, and you'll see who has made what percentage contribution to the grand total of cases sold. And you can see we've got our superstar here, Sam, at 13.36%. But let's say we wanted to also look at the amount of money each employee has brought in. We can also do that. So add, we're going to add item cost. And we'll look at that, expand it out a little here so you can see it. There we go. So we've got the amount, but that doesn't hold a lot of meaning in the grand scheme of things. We're going to change it also to percentage of the profit in the company. And now we can see there is a slight difference between being a top seller of cases versus bringing in more money. Now, for some, it's not a huge difference. Like for Sam here, it's just a small decimal percentage. But for others, you've got a bit of a difference, and you can see that. So my question for everybody that's here today is, which of these would you want to use to rate how your employees would be performing? Would you want to have a look at how much they're bringing in profit-wise or how many cases they're selling? Which one of these metrics would be better? You can type your answer in the chat. And I can show you, we can sort by number of cases and see who we've got. And we can also look at cost of items, and you can see that that does change who's at the top and who's at the bottom. So there is definitely a little bit of difference there. So, Ms. Jamie, did we have any responses?
We did not.
Well, I'm going to give away the answer, at least in my opinion. I think I'd rather look at the amount of profit brought in by a salesperson versus the number of cases, because that's going to make the most impact on your company. That's my personal opinion. I think fiscally it makes sense, but I am not in any way a business person, so. All right. So, do we have any questions about playing with these numbers here? There are a lot of other things that you can play around with. So let's focus back onto our, we'll do, instead of number of cases, a little more exciting. We'll look at our item cost. We're going to change this back to default, and then we're going to look at instead the maximum sale. You can select maximum and it'll show you. Looks like everybody's made the same sale at the maximum. Let's switch this to cases then. I thought cases would be more boring, but I was wrong. There we go, maximum. So you can see that most of our employees are at least selling a maximum of 20 cases per transaction, but some people are underperforming a little. You can also look at minimum. And it looks like everybody's had the same amount of bad days as far as sales, and I've only managed to sell one case to a company at a given time, which is unfortunate. But there's a lot of other options here, and these really get into how it's useful to your data. Some of them are really not useful at all to this particular data set. It just depends on what you're working with. So feel free to explore those different ones on your own with different data sets that you might have available. And if you ever have a question about what the different categories are here, you can always look it up under help, and you can type in what you're looking for, and it'll give you a little bit of help there on that. If you wanted to double check that your data matches up, say we're looking at our max and you're like, oh, there's no way that 20 is the max. They've had to have sold more per or less per transaction. You can come back to your original data here. And with the whole thing highlighted, you can actually add filters to it so that we can look at our number of cases. So I'm going to show you that real quick. It's not directly related to pivot tables, but it's handy if you're wanting to really manipulate your data a bit and make sure that everything's showing up correctly. So you come over here to data and create filter, and you'll see that adds a filter to all the headers here. And then we can choose to sort from A to Z, which would be the bottom sales here of only one case. Or we can choose to sort from Z to A, which puts the greater number here. And we can see the 20s and the 19s. And so, nope, we haven't had a single sale that was more than 20. All right, any questions before we go on to our last segment?
Looks like we are good to move on.
Okay, so much like the filters that we just put onto our table of our regular table, we can also do filtering on our pivot table. So on the tab for Slicer, we've got a pre-set up table here that we are going to be filtering. So we've got our customers and our products lined up here nice and neat. And so a traditional filter will use the filter area here. So instead of adding filters like we did for our table that we were just playing with, you'd add the field that you want to filter by here. So let's say we want to look at it by, let's do salesperson. So let's say we're wanting to look at this because of a performance review, and you want to be able to highlight the data specifically for each person as you talk to them. So right now we're showing all items, and the filter stays here in the pivot table editor, which is slightly different than what some of you may be familiar with Excel, where you get the little bar across the top. And so we can clear all, which would mean that there's no data. If you did that, say you'd have absolutely no information. And let's say we're wanting to do a performance review for Meg Benson. You can click on her and select OK. And then we look at her numbers specifically for Happy Mart and the product. So this is kind of similar to how we had it set up with the 2 rows where we had the salesperson and the customer in there, but it's a lot more compact. So if you're wanting to be able to just specifically focus on an individual person, instead of having your salesperson in your rows, you can have them down here in your filters to narrow it down. If, say, your salespeople work in a team and you want to see how they're doing together, you could always select multiple. You see the 2 check marks, hit OK, and that'll adjust your numbers. If you want to go back to having all of the data, of course, you can do select all. And it'll bring it back to the full total. You can also filter by conditions. So you could look at, the date before, the date after, greater or lesser, all sorts of different things that you can tinker with here to give it a specific condition to help filter your data. So you could do this with dates. So you could do, if you just wanted to look at the year, since we don't have the flexibility of moving the year down here to filter, we could do the date is after and do 12/31, 2019, and that should get us the information for 2020 because it's after that date, or maybe not. There we go. Let's try that again. Let's cancel this out. I want to get it to behave itself. So we've got our filter for condition, date is after, exact date. There we go. I think it's behaving itself now. So let's see if it'll behave itself now. 12/31. Okay, well, it was a nice thought. I'll have to look into why that's misbehaving. But anyways, so you can also filter by other topics. So right now we still have salesperson, but you could take that off and filter by item cost. You could even filter by ones that are already in the table. So you could filter by customer. So if you wanted to be able to shrink your table down and just focus on Happy Mart, you could do that. Forgot to take off snacks some more. So you could do that to adjust what's being shown on the table at that time. So that's the basics of filter. But we can also do something that's a little more flexible and a little more visually appealing, at least in my opinion, is the slicer. So do we have any questions about filters before I touch on slicers, lickety split?
No questions on filters.
Okay, so real quick, since we're starting to run out of time, so to do a slicer, which is really the exact same thing as a filter, just something that you can move around on your sheet and it's a little more visually appealing. You make sure you've got a cell in your table highlighted, come up to data here at the top and add a slicer. So it will predetermine what range you're using. If ever you go to create a slicer and you've accidentally clicked outside of your table, you can select your data range just like we did with creating our pivot table by clicking on that. You just want to make sure that it's actually got your original data set rather than the slicer, because that gives you the flexibility to pick different fields than the ones that are currently selected. So let's close that out. So once you've got it created, you can move it around anywhere you like. You can adjust its size, whatever you like there, but it's not going to let you start filtering until you've chosen your field to work with. So let's say we're doing the same type of filtering that we were doing before, so salesperson. And now you can click on either this part right here that says all or this little button here. Both of those work to expand it. And you can see we've got the same filtering options that we had before. So we could clear it out and look just at Meg and hit OK. The nice thing about slicers is you can have multiple at once and it gives you a lot of flexibility. So let's add another slicer real quick. So data, add slicer, And we'll bring this bad boy over here so we can look at both of them. And this one we're going to do instead region. So the nice thing about this, so let's say we had all of our salespeople selected. One slicer will affect the other slicer. So if you have selected, let's say we only want to look at the Northeast region, and we hit OK, that will change who is available up here, because not all of our salespeople work out of the same region. So when we click on it, we see only the people that work in that region. And then you could narrow it down by those people. So that's a perk to the slicer. You can also copy a slicer, you can edit it, you can delete it. You can also just straight delete it from here when it's highlighted like this by using the delete button or backspace button, and that should let you also delete it. Or maybe it's not going to listen to me today. Oh, there we go. So let's see, delete it. You can also make them look prettier if you're wanting to really fancy it up. So under slicer here, get our slicer. You can double click on the slicer to open up the editing window for it. And you can come over here to customize, and that'll let you pick the name of the slicer, the type of font you want to use, the size. So if you want to make it really big, you can really make it show up. You can change the format, the color of the text, and the background. So this is all just, aesthetics, make it look pretty. Or, make your different slicers stand out so that they're not all gray, so that you know which one's which just by looking at the color. All right, well, we are out of time. So if you have any questions, we can still answer those before we close out for the day. So do put those in the chat or the Q&A and we'll answer them.
So we did have someone ask, what kind of career or business applications pivot tables would have? Do you have any recommendations for like the types of people who would benefit most from using pivot tables, like people working in an office setting or people who are working with statistics?
I mean, it's got a wide range of uses. The most experience I've had is working with sales numbers, just because they're something easily relatable. I myself am not a statistician, so being able to pivot statistical data is kind of meaningless to me. But if you have basically any table that you have where you want to be able to look at different aspects of the data, pivot tables will come in handy. It's not as handy if you've got like one set of values that you're working with and just a straightforward set of rows and columns that you're working with. But when you end up with something like this over here, where we've got a ton of rows, we've got a bunch of different headers of columns that you could look at in different ways and put together to get different meanings, that's where pivot tables will come in handy. I hope that helps.
We did have someone ask if you have a strong preference over working with Google Sheets versus working with Excel to do pivot tables.
Well, so what I have learned, because I've taught the pivot tables Excel class first, and so when we came up with the idea for Sheets, I had to kind of figure out what the differences were and adapt the curriculum. Sheets is still kind of new, and I think they have some limitations in what they can do, I'm assuming due to copyright and protected code and that sort of stuff. So they have a few limited functionalities that Excel I find is very useful for, like the dates. Being able to filter by dates is a lot easier to do on Excel. You can do it on Sheets. It just takes a lot of effort and a little bit of a workaround, and you have to tinker with your actual original data set. But there are some nice things about Sheets, some ways that they organize data easier. something I forgot to mention is, say you needed to change any of your information in your original data set. In Sheets, it automatically updates your pivot tables. You don't have to remember to hit the little button that says update, and then it updates all the pivot tables. Excel, unfortunately, you still have to hit that button. Otherwise, any changes you make to your original data don't show up in the pivot table. So, there's pros and cons. Now that now that Excel has its own online version, and a lot of people have access to that, there's not as much of a benefit of Sheets where you can access it anywhere, but Sheets is free, whereas Excel, unless you have it through your company or your own product that you've bought yourself, you have to pay for it. So there is that downside to it. Any other questions? Let's see, I see a question about, is it safe to use the free version? So I wouldn't have, see, I'm not 100% sure on the level of encryption that Google Sheets does with their data. So I'm not sure exactly how protected that information is versus Excel. So if you have any sensitive information, like if you're working with social security numbers or anything like that, that you have even just an inkling concern of people being able to get access to, I would say probably don't do it in Google Sheets, especially because since it's linked directly to your Gmail account, if any email hackers are able to get into your email, they then have access to your Google Drive information. So if it's something like, your business's profits for the year or something like that, that's not going to really have a devastating impact on your life, not a big deal. If it's something like people's social security numbers that you need to be really protective with, I'd probably steer clear of Google Sheets for that. But again, that's from a absolutely zero knowledge of what kind of encryption Google Sheets offers versus Excel. All right. Any other questions? Because if not, we will wrap it up for the day. Again, this has been recorded, so we will have a recording sent out to you so that you can practice with the practice sheet that was available if you didn't get a chance to do that today. And Ms. Jamie, did you have something to add?
We did have someone who asked about additional ways to practice. So I did want to reiterate that in addition to having access to our practice sheet and the recording, you can also use your library card to access lynda.com tutorials for free as an additional learning option.
Absolutely.
And I dropped a link in the chat for that.
Absolutely. And there are specific courses on Google Sheets. And in fact, there's one on doing pivot tables that is a 3-hour course versus our little hour here. So it really gets in depth. So I highly recommend trying that out. There's also ones for tips and tricks and for some of the other class topics that we've covered earlier as well. So give those a try. They're free with your card, so why not, right? All right, well, thank you all for joining us. If you don't have any more questions, we will call it a day. Thank you.